I'm excited about this topic, sustainable food. How do we get sustainability as far as food? We're going to be talking about edible food forests, edible landscaping, perennial vegetables, and polycultures. There are books written on each of these. In fact, Dave Jackie has a 2-book set entitled Edible Forest Gardens. Rosalind Creasy wrote a book entitled Edible Landscaping. There's a book, Landscaping with Fruit. And there's another one, Edible Flower Garden. Oh, sounds pretty good. I'll bet it looks pretty too. But you know, I have a horticulturalist friend that has done a lot of landscaping, and she's used a lot of edibles in her landscaping. And I said to her one day, okay, so if you do the edible landscaping thing, how much of a family's dietary requirements can you get out of the landscaping? Without hesitation, she said, oh, you could easily get 40 to 50%. And frankly, if you do an edible food forest, you can grow 90% of what you eat from permanent plantings. Now, you're not going to go pick pineapple in the middle of winter, but as long as you're willing to eat when it comes ripe, well, that's the deal with sustainable food. You reduce labor and inputs, and you multiply your production 3 to 100 times because you have many things growing in the same space. So let's unpack all this. Years ago in America, there was a character that was larger than life. I know those 2 little girls down at his feet because they're my granddaughters, 2 favorite ones. But Johnny Appleseed collected the apple seeds from the mills where they made cider throughout the country, and he went around spreading apple seeds. What a legacy we know him for. Well, why should we be thinking about edible food forests and sustainable food? Because 90 to 95% of your food can come from your food forest. Landscaping and perennial vegetables. Perennial vegetables, let's define that. That's a vegetable that you plant that comes up and produces year after year, and you don't have to keep planting it year after year. Bill Mollison and David Holmgren of permaculture fame says, perhaps we seek to recreate the Garden of Eden. And why not? We believe that a low-energy, high-yield agriculture is possible, a possible aim for the whole world, and that it needs only human energy and intellect to achieve this. So, by some intention, we can get real. The book 1491 is a very interesting book because I had this mental picture of the land that the Indians lived in before any Europeans came to America. And when I read 1491, I thought, oh wow, I'm going to have to change my mental view because the eyewitness accounts of the people that were there showed that the forests were largely cleared of undergrowth, that usually there were groves, high canopy of trees producing mast, which is hickory nuts and acorns that the Indians used primarily for food. And yes, they did have some forests where they hunted, but the vast majority were these food forests that they had created and kept the underbrush clean from. And then the book Tending the Wild talks about the way the original Indians tended the wild plants in the western part of America. and the lengths they went to produce the native foods. Well, I have to realize that by so doing, they didn't have near the pest and disease pressure that I have in my garden if I plant a regular monoculture garden. So how do we go about all of this? First, we need to do a site assessment. Obviously, if you live on one of the Caribbean islands or down in Inter-America, your climate, your temperature, your rainfall, solar access, and wind patterns are going to be different. We live right at the base of a mountain, and the wind comes and hits the mountain and comes right down on our master bedroom door. And you better have things buttoned down pretty well when the wind comes. In fact, I've had to go put a bungee cord on one of my chicken tractors to keep the lid down because several times the wind has blown it up. You need to study the soil, the geology, the structure. We're going to take a look at a place. The place where we're living, it's a farm, all right, but it's a rock farm because there are a lot of rocks there. It's a rock lover's paradise. But how do you grow stuff? Well, there's plenty of sand, so we'll talk about that. The structure, the texture, the fertility is impacted. Erosion, yeah, sure, sand erodes a whole lot faster off a hill than other soil. And remediation, what do you do with that? And how do you deal with it? And then water, how it flows, the drainage, how to harvest water, how to store it, and how to recycle it and use it down through time. We also need to be experts regarding plants, the existing plants. And there are many plants that we can forage and eat, and then there are plants that we can learn about, and this is the hard part for me because many of these plants are not familiar to me. Yes, I see them, they're native, or they're native over here, or a few people have these, but they're not the regular garden variety seeds and plants. But if they are perennials and they produce every year, I think I probably need to get to know them. So, indicator plants. What can we tell about the soil and about the other plants from the plants that we see? Their plant health, the benefits of plants, and the detriment of each. We're going to talk a good bit more detail about those. Animals, the pathways. You know that the roads that we drive on, except the last 40 or 50 years, were basically the animal trails. That they widened a little bit and put bridges on. Only since the interstate system was put in did we really depart from that and go a different direction. Their pathways, food, water, and shelter. If you provide enough food for the deer over here, they won't want to come eat your stuff right here. So we need to look at, if I don't want a skunk eating my eggs, then I need to make provision for that as I think about how I'm going to deal with my chickens. The existing structures that are there, available resources, limiting factors, utilities, and the history of the use of the land. What are the interactions with the surrounding area? The impact of what we might design and how that would impact the area. And then our needs, our wants, and our goals. All of this goes into a site assessment. While I would love to be able to do a site assessment for you, I can tell you right up front, you're going to be doing a better job of your own site assessment than I will. Now, I could help you. I know a lot of the parameters, but I don't know what you like to eat. I don't know the particular things that you want in a given site, and I don't know your preferences. So you need to be actively involved. And so while I'm excited about it, I'm also challenged by it because my learning curve is a lot steeper than the normal things that I'm used to. Site preparation. How do you catch the water along the contour of the hill, put it into ponds, and let the ponds seep and drain lower to water the field below the pond? Do you catch the rainwater off of your roof and put it into a storage pond? Cover cropping and soil remediation. When you've got a lot of sand, you don't have a lot of organic matter. And you need to develop that with cover cropping. And establishing windbreaks. I'm very thankful that even though I built the house a little bit up on the side of the hill, not far away is a windbreak that breaks the actual wind coming off the mountain. So instead of 70 to 100 miles an hour, it only may be 40 to 60. That's a protective barrier. As we look at plants, we need to select the appropriate plants from the standpoint, and you remember optimal plant growth, temperature, water, light, and soil requirements. And we need to look at that in comparison to what we have, because remember, we're not going to have the ideal place. We're going to have to create it to some degree. We can vary size and the growth habit of the plants that we use. A food forest is generally considered to be comprised of a 7-layer system. First, you have a canopy, an upper story of trees. Then you have, and those can be, well, we'll name them in a little bit. And then you have lower trees. Many times those can be fruit trees. And then you have shrubs. Then you have herbs. You can have ground cover and roots, and then vines that grow up into, and that is what is called a food forest, that 7-layer system. We need to look also for the appropriate plants that will fill all the needed function. We need to plan redundancy and stack functions. There are some plants that really do well outside of direct sunlight. One of them that I'm thinking about is ginseng. It wants 70% shade. In fact, in writing the book, Growing Money, there's only one type of ginseng that's financially viable in North America, and that's wild simulated, because most of the ginseng is produced in China, and they've cut the trees and they don't have the shade to produce wild simulated ginseng. So we may have some nurse plants that we want to shade plants until there's enough shade naturally from the other plants. Scaffold plants that a vine needs something to grow on. And you may decide that you put it on a plant that you later take out once it's served its function, and that could be a scaffold plant, or there are chaperone plants. They are plants that help other plants get started and grow, and they will protect the plant that you truly want to grow. We need to use members of plants from many plant families to increase diversity. There are 7 main types of apples right now. There used to be about 7,000. So we have a very small sample for all the apple pests to shoot at. The greater your diversity, the better off you're going to be. And we need to plan for succession, because once these plants get taller, what are we going to do? Do we chop them down and plant others? What do we do? We need to think about succession. As we look at a food forest, there are some species that we can think about and talk about. The canopy, pecans, walnuts, Korean nut pines. Do you like pine nuts? That's where they come from. You can grow your own. That's many times the canopy. As you can imagine, you're going to have year-round shade from a Korean nut pine, as opposed to the pecans and walnuts, where you're going to have shade spring to fall. Low tree, pear, plum, apple, peach, pawpaw, mulberry, apricot, persimmon, and almonds. And then the shrubs, hazelnuts, blueberries, raspberries, goji berries, blackberries, golden berries. There are all sorts of shrubs, berries, herbs, garlic, chives. Chives has a lot more food value in it than the garlic does. Multiplier onions, dill, fennel, oregano, ground cover, comfrey. We're going to look at some comfrey, some Russian comfrey that I have. My chickens would die for comfrey. And daffodil. Why do you plant daffodil under trees? Well, it inhibits the grass. And if it's a tree like an apple that you don't want a lot of grass under, you plant flowers under there, and you have plenty of flowers. A root. Daikon radishes are nature's subsoiler. They'll go down 3 feet. They die off. When they're frozen, they rot. And what happens? They provide a 3-foot tunnel for water to go right down into the soil and be taken up in the soil. And then vines, muscadines, hardy kiwi, grapes, all sorts of things. So these are just a few of the possibilities in a food forest. Every planting that we have has what is known as a guild. If you have an apple tree and you plant an apple tree, there is an apple tree guild. And you can go on the web and search apple tree guild, and you can get fancy pictures and fancy descriptions of the things that people do underneath apple trees. Number one, you have a central element. Let's talk about an apple. Let's talk about a semi-dwarf, because if you don't get a semi-dwarf, it's going to get too big on you. It's not going to be just a tree. It's going to be... And then you're going to want grass-suppressing bulbs. Daffodils, camas, perennial alliums, onions, garlic, sunchokes, flowering bulbs. And then you want insectiary plants. Those plants that will attract the right bugs. Dill, fennel, coriander, bee balm, echinacea, lupin, feverfew, foxglove. If you're beginning to see what I see, you can have a whole herb garden under a fruit tree. And so, is it getting exciting or what? And then you want things that attract the birds. A butterfly bush, fuchsia, salvia. Now, I have not heard of some of these plants, but in some of the books they have them, and they'll tell you where they'll grow and under what conditions, and you can study it. Mulch plants, comfrey, artichoke, rhubarb, clover, nasturtium. I'm seeing chicken feed pretty good right there. Clover and comfrey. Nitrogen fixers, alfalfa, clover, lupine, edible legumes, gumi, bladder senna, Siberian pea shrub. That's a shrub that fixes nitrogen. And then the soil fumigants and pest repellents. Okay, here we go. Nasturtium. You see, we talked about nasturtium back up there. Maybe we really need to get some nasturtiums. Marigold, garlic, onions, chives, parsnip, carrot. Man, I'm getting hungry. I think we can get a meal right here under the apple tree. And then the habitat. What do you do with your broken terracotta pipe or that clay pot that you cracked? Don't throw it away. Whatever you do, don't throw it away, because that's the perfect place to turn it over and make a house for Mr. Toad. Do you know how much Mr. Toad eats in a day? Now, I can't tell you that. I'd have to look it up. But I can tell you how much a bluebird, how many insects. I can't tell you the number, but I can tell you the percentage of body weight that a bluebird eats in insects every day. You ready for this? 1/3 of its body weight. And I'm sure purple martins are right along in there, and I'm for them. Because if they'll eat the pests for my plants, I'm all for it. I don't have to worry about it near as much. Habitat, rock and brush piles. Oh, I've got a rock farm. I got plenty of rocks. Puddles. Oh, this sounds like more frogs or toads. And pottery. And so there you have a tree guild. Well, I thought we were talking about an apple tree. Well, we are. But we're talking about a whole lot more. And again, if you don't like garlic, don't plant garlic. But if you want edible flowers and you're willing to eat nasturtiums, plant them. Because you can go out and pick nasturtiums right out from under your apple tree and eat them. Food forest resources. Now, this doesn't look like the standard garden, but this is a food forest. Jackie's Edible Food Forest 2-volume set. The first volume deals with the vision and the theory. I'd suggest you're going to need some vision and some theory if you haven't taken a course. And then the second volume is design and practice. Now that you understand a little about it, how do you design it and how do you implement it? That's edible forest gardens. Gaia's garden is about a number of gardens and a lot of, well, it's only about so thick, a pretty good book, but it gives you a whole overview. And you need to, if you get serious about this, as serious as I am and as excited, you need to go take that North Carolina State free permaculture course. And you need to learn what you're doing because you may want to practice it. And then there's a book about perennial vegetables. What do you choose as in the way of vegetables so that you can keep getting vegetables without planting them? Where do you plant them in your garden? What are the growing requirements that you can optimize for any given plant? Understand that some of the plants can grow in your gray water lagoon. You can eat cattails. You know, there are a lot of things. You just need to be intentional. Think about your site. You're going to have sort of a marshy area. Plant that stuff down there where it can get plenty. And then over, you see what I'm talking about. But include perennial vegetables. Some of my friends are growing dryland rice. I didn't know you could do that. But sure, they have plenty of rice. They have to keep all the birds out of it to be able to have enough to eat, but that's just part of it. And they really appreciate and like it. Edible landscape. My favorite activity is to go out in the morning and walk down along the red raspberry bushes and pick my breakfast. I'd just as soon do that as anything else. But here we've got Swiss chard, we've got leucinata kale, we've got all sorts of edible plants and flowers and all sorts of things. So my question of you is, how is that going to look for you? Because when you look at polycultures, the most sustainable growing areas known in the world are the milpas in Mexico. That's the only known system that has permitted long-term land use, and some of them have been productive for over 4,000 years. Same ground, same stuff, but it interacts and it adds, and they keep tending it and picking it. It's nutritionally and environmentally complementary. What do they grow? Well, they grow what they eat: maize, corn, avocado, multiple varieties of squash and beans, melon, tomatoes, chilies, sweet potatoes, jicama, amaranth, and mucuna. All off of one piece of dirt. Sounds pretty good to me. So, if you're going to implement this, you need to do a site review and get a plan going. Look at your microclimate. Look at the things that you really want to eat. Get your compost going. Do your earthwork and soil preparation. Study cover cropping and tree and bush planting. And we're going to talk more about that especially. It's far easier to get a few plants and propagate your plants in an intermittent mist bed than to be able to afford 100 plants. 10 plants are easier, and you can take those 10 plants this year, prune them, and have 100 for next. And then, once you get it all in, what do you got to do? Well, it's pretty simple from there. You tend it, and you keep it. And you keep picking it, and you're pretty good off because you got plenty to eat.